As the man reached for his meal, a small, desperate voice cut through the air. "Don't eat that." No one paid attention at first. Just a homeless kid, another forgotten face in the crowd. But the urgency in his voice, the fear in his eyes, something about it sent a chill down the spine. What could a child like him possibly know? And why did he seem so certain? What happened next was beyond anyone's imagination. The Park Cafe was a beacon of luxury, a place where the city's elite gathered beneath neatly trimmed trees and the soft murmur of a nearby fountain. It was midday, and the cafe was alive with movement. Waiters in crisp white uniforms wove effortlessly between tables, balancing trays filled with handcrafted dishes and steaming cups of espresso. The air carried the rich scent of freshly baked bread, mingling with the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine. But for one man, none of it mattered. At a prime table in the heart of it all sat Richard Langford, a name that carried weight in every boardroom and private club across the city. He had built his empire from nothing, starting with a single real estate deal in his 20s and expanding into industries that most wouldn't dare to touch. Now, at 72, he exuded the quiet confidence of a man who didn't just control his own fate, but perhaps the fates of those around him. His tailored navy suit, polished cufflinks, and gold-rimmed glasses were the silent emblems of a lifetime spent at the top. Yet, as he studied the menu, his movements were deliberate, almost hesitant. Across from him sat Vanessa, his much younger wife, a vision of effortless beauty. With sleek black hair cascading over her shoulders and a face that seemed sculpted for magazine covers, she was impossible to ignore. Her crimson lipstick was flawless, her diamond bracelet catching the sunlight as she absently twirled it around her wrist. But despite the poised elegance, there was something distant in her expression. Her eyes remained fixed on her phone screen, barely acknowledging the man across from her. Just beyond the patio fence, a boy lingered. Small for his age, he blended into the background, his hoodie hanging loosely over his thin frame, his dark eyes scanning the tables, the plates, the pockets of well-dressed patrons. He wasn't there to admire the scenery. He was looking for something. His name was Malik, though few would bother to ask. No one inside the cafe knew him. To them, he was just another shadow, a kid who drifted along this street with nowhere to be. His face was familiar but forgettable, always on the periphery of conversations, at the edges of concern. At the center of it all, Richard Langford checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "You're distracted again," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. Across the table, Vanessa looked up from her phone, offering a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm right here," she replied sweetly, reaching across the table to place a delicate hand over his. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Just beyond the patio fence, Malik edged closer. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder of the hunger gnawing at him. He moved with practiced silence, pressing against the railing as his gaze locked onto Richard's table. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months. A pristine white bowl of soup, a warm baguette resting beside it, a glass of sparkling water catching the sunlight. It looked almost unreal, like something from the glossy pages of a magazine. But then something shifted. Richard adjusted his glasses and picked up his phone. In that fleeting moment, Malik saw her move. Vanessa's hand dipped into her designer handbag. Her fingers wrapped around something small, something glass. With a practiced flick of her wrist, she twisted open a tiny vial and tilted it just slightly over the steaming bowl. A clear liquid slipped into the soup there, 1 second, gone the next. Malik's breath hitched. He froze. She stirred the spoon through the broth like nothing had happened, her expression as smooth as ever. Then she leaned in toward Richard, her voice just low enough to be missed by everyone else. "After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now." A chill ran down Malik's spine. For a second, he wondered if he had imagined it. Could a woman like her, draped in wealth, seated in a place so pristine, really be doing what he thought? But something in the way she spoke, in the way she didn't even glance at what she'd done, it unsettled him. His heart pounded as he shrank lower behind the railing. No one else had noticed. No one else had been watching. Just him. The hunger twisting in his stomach pulled him back to reality, but his eyes never left the couple. Richard looked tired, distracted, his spoon hovering above the bowl as he scrolled through his phone. Across from him, Vanessa was the picture of poise, her smile bright, her chin resting on her hand as if she hadn't just whispered something chilling moments ago. Malik swallowed hard. He could walk away. Why get involved? Who would believe a kid like him, a boy in a threadbare hoodie, standing at the edges of a world that never once looked back at him? But something about this felt wrong, and he wasn't sure if he could ignore it. He wasn't welcome here. Malik knew that. Swallowing hard, he glanced around at the other patrons, laughter, conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china. No one noticed him. No one cared. But his eyes snapped back to Richard's spoon, now dipping into the soup. His chest tightened. This wasn't just in his head. He had seen it. He knew what would happen if the old man took a bite. His thoughts raced. He didn't know this man, but that didn't matter. Right was right, and wrong was wrong. The moment stretched endlessly. Then, without thinking, Malik shoved himself off the railing and marched straight to the table. His legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that." Heads turned. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Somewhere, a fork clattered onto a plate, the sharp sound ringing through the cafe. At the table, Richard froze his spoon inches from his lips, his wide eyes locked onto the boy standing before him. Across from him, Vanessa whipped her head around, her expression shifting in an instant. Her voice was sharp enough to slice through glass. "What did you just say?" Malik didn't falter. His voice wavered, but he forced it out loud enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food. I saw her. Don't eat it." A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Every patron turned toward the unfolding scene, their eyes flicking between the boy, the man, and the woman now sitting stiffly in her chair. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Richard blinked, glancing between his wife and the boy. His voice was steady, but when he set the spoon down, his hand trembled. "Vanessa," he exhaled slowly. "What is he talking about?" Something in her snapped. She shot to her feet, the legs of her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. Her face twisted not in shock, but in fury. "You little liar." The words slithered through gritted teeth, low and sharp, drenched in venom. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile?" She turned sharply, eyes darting toward the waitstaff. "Who even let this street rat in here?" The words hit like a slap. But Malik stood his ground. His heart pounded in his chest, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. But Malik didn't back down. His eyes stayed locked on Richard, pleading with him to see the truth. "I saw her," he said, his voice stronger now. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. If you don't believe me, smell it." A shadow passed over Richard's face. The color drained from his cheeks as he turned to his wife, his gaze sharpening. "Vanessa," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What's going on?" She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on," she said, her tone dripping with exasperation. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him, he probably just wants money or food." She spat the words like they were something filthy, her eyes flicking to Malik with open disdain. But the boy didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his small fists clenched. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice rising. "She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Richard's hand hovered over the bowl, torn between disbelief and the gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. Something in the boy's tone made him hesitate. The air around the table grew thick, the cafe's usual liveliness sucked into a suffocating silence. Forks were left untouched, conversations abandoned. Every eye in the room was now on them. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the boy with a scrutinizing gaze. He had spent decades in boardrooms, dealing with liars, manipulators, and people desperate to take advantage of him. But this was different. The kid didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "Malik, is it?" Richard's voice was measured, though a trace of suspicion remained. Malik nodded. "Yes." His voice softened, but his conviction held firm. "I'm telling the truth. Please, don't eat it." A sharp, humorless laugh broke the tension. Vanessa crossed her arms, her stare cold and unyielding. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "He's just some street kid looking for attention. Are you really going to entertain this nonsense, Richard?" But Richard didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the spoon, this time holding it closer to his face. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. A quiet storm was brewing inside him. His eyes never left hers as he spoke. "Vanessa," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You heard him. What exactly is going on here?" For the first time, her mask slipped. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her composure cracking at the edges. "I can't believe you're even asking me that," she hissed. "It's insulting." But the way her voice wavered, just for a second, told him everything he needed to know. Vanessa turned to the growing crowd, her voice rising in desperation. "He's lying. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are, Richard. Why would you trust him over me?" The weight of her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the effect she'd hoped for. The crowd was shifting now, murmurs rippling through the cafe. People exchanged glances, their whispers barely contained. Did she really do it? Look at her. She seems nervous. That kid doesn't look like he's making this up. The doubt in their eyes only fueled Vanessa's fury. Her composure snapped. With a sharp bang, she slammed her hands onto the table, rattling the silverware. "Enough of this, Richard. Eat your damn soup, and let's go." She hissed, her voice trembling with rage, but Malik wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "You're rich. You've got lawyers, doctors, people who can figure it out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it." A muscle in Richard's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered back to the bowl. The spoon was still in his hand, but he didn't lift it to his lips. His tired, calculating gaze shifted this time, not to the boy, but to his wife. His voice was low, steady. "Vanessa," he said slowly, "you've been acting strange for weeks now. And this?" Her face paled. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her confidence wavering for the first time. Richard didn't let her finish. "You can't seriously think I'd poison me," he cut in, his tone razor-sharp. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. The whispers swelled into an audible hum of disbelief. Malik stood firm. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he refused to look away. He had done what he could. Now it was up to Richard. Vanessa straightened, her expression shifting into something cold, unfamiliar. Her lips curled slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice was devoid of emotion. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense," Vanessa snapped, grabbing her handbag. But before she could move, Richard's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. For a man his age, his grip was surprisingly strong. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." The cafe, frozen in stunned silence, seemed to hold its breath. Then, at last, a waiter who had been standing motionless, watching it all unfold, finally spoke. "Sir, should I call the police?" The words sent a ripple through the cafe. For the first time, Vanessa looked truly panicked. She shook her head violently. "Don't you dare," she spat, her voice almost frantic. "This is just a misunderstanding. Richard, you can't seriously." But he lifted a hand, cutting her off without even looking at her. "Yes," he said to the waiter, his voice cool, steady. "Call them." Malik felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. The truth wasn't out yet, and the tension was far from over. The cafe seemed to exhale all at once as the waiter rushed inside to make the call. Every pair of eyes in the room stayed glued to the table, anticipation thick in the air. Richard finally let go of Vanessa's wrist, but his gaze never wavered. The woman who had once carried herself with effortless charm was now unraveling before them. Her eyes darted around the room, her lips parting slightly as if searching for an escape, but finding none. Meanwhile, Malik stood a few steps back, his hands trembling. He had done everything he could. But doubt crept in, cold and unwelcome. What if Richard didn't believe him after all? What if Vanessa somehow talked her way out of this? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand his ground. Then Richard spoke again. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Malik." The boy snapped to attention. "You said you saw her put something in the soup. Can you describe it?" Malik nodded quickly and took a step forward. It was a small bottle, like the kind you'd use for medicine, clear liquid. "She poured it in when you were looking at your phone, then stirred it. I swear, I saw it." Richard's expression hardened. His gaze shifted back to Vanessa, who was already shaking her head. "This is absurd. He's lying. Why would he lie?" Richard interrupted, his voice like ice. What could he possibly gain from this? The crowd murmured again. Then the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. The atmosphere grew even more charged, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Vanessa's eyes flicked to the soup. For a fraction of a second, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely. She looked cornered, desperate. And then, as if grasping at straws, she turned on Malik. Her voice was sharp, seething. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something." The words hit Malik like a slap. But the difference was, he wasn't the one panicking. But Malik stood his ground. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not jealous," he said, his voice firm. "I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him." The sirens outside grew louder, their shrill wail cutting through the heavy silence. A moment later, 2 police officers stepped into the cafe. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table, their presence shifting the energy in an instant. Their hands rested casually on their belts, but there was nothing casual about their expressions. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his voice neutral but firm. Richard rose from his chair. Despite his age, he still carried himself with authority, his presence commanding respect. "Officers," he said evenly, gesturing toward the untouched bowl of soup. "I need you to take a look at this. This boy claims my wife poisoned it." A flicker of surprise passed between the 2 officers, but their faces remained unreadable. One of them leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously before turning to Vanessa. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" Her face flushed crimson. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice shaking with frustration. "He's just a street kid trying to stir up trouble. Richard, are you seriously letting it get this far?" But the officer wasn't buying it. "We need to test the contents," he said, reaching for the bowl. "No," the word ripped from Vanessa's throat before she could stop it. Her voice was too sharp, too frantic. The outburst rippled through the cafe like a gunshot. More heads turned, more eyes locked onto her. The second officer's expression darkened. "Ma'am," he said, his tone now edged with suspicion, "is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed?" Vanessa's breath hitched. She hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For the first time, she looked trapped. Her gaze darted between Richard and the officers, her hands clutching her designer handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then finally, her resolve cracked. With a bitter laugh, she exhaled sharply. "Fine." The word came out like a curse, her voice low, venomous. You want the truth?" She turned to Richard, her eyes burning with something almost unrecognizable. "I'm tired of living in your shadow. Tired of you controlling everything." She took a slow breath, her expression twisting into something cold. "You were never supposed to make it past this year. And she stopped abruptly. Realization hit too late. The cafe erupted in gasps. Some patrons instinctively pulled out their phones, their screens lighting up as they started recording. Across the table, Richard's face went pale. The weight of her confession hit him like a truck. One of the officers stepped forward, his expression grim. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them." Vanessa's composure shattered completely. She screamed, thrashing as the officer secured her hands behind her back. "You don't understand. I deserved everything. He had everything." She shrieked as they dragged her toward the exit, her voice echoing through the stunned cafe. No one moved, no one spoke. Richard sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he pushed the untouched bowl of soup away. For a long moment, he said nothing. His face was an unreadable mask of disbelief, of betrayal. Then, his eyes found Malik. The boy stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. But as Richard looked at him, really looked at him, the anger in his expression softened. A flicker of something else took its place. Gratitude. The cafe slowly returned to a low hum of whispers and murmurs. The officers led Vanessa through the doors, her protests fading into the distance. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, still reeling from what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Richard with pity, others with curiosity. But Malik didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, unsure if he was supposed to stay or simply slip away quietly. Then Richard turned to him. His face was still pale, but his eyes were steady. "Malik." His voice was softer now. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit." Malik hesitated, his gaze flicking to the lingering onlookers. But there was something about Richard's voice, a weight to it. Slowly, Malik sank into the chair, his shoulders still tense. Richard exhaled, his fingers pressing lightly against the tabletop. "You saved my life." His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in it. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Malik fidgeted, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I couldn't let it happen." His voice was quiet. "I couldn't just watch and say nothing." Richard nodded, his gaze distant as if replaying the entire ordeal in his mind. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. Most people would have. He looked Malik in the eye. They would have turned the other way, pretended they didn't see, but you didn't. A beat passed. "That took courage, boy." Malik shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess. I just don't like seeing people get hurt. That's all." Richard leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he really saw Malik. Not just as a scrappy kid hanging around the streets, but as something more. But now Richard saw something more. Not just a kid lingering on the streets, but someone with a story, a soul. He studied Malik for a long moment before asking, "How long have you been out here?" The question caught Malik off guard. He shifted in his chair, looking away. His voice was quiet, tinged with something that almost sounded like embarrassment. "A while." Richard frowned but didn't press. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. "Wait here." He stood and stepped aside to make a call. Malik watched him warily, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Was he in trouble now? Was Richard calling someone to have him removed? His hands curled into fists beneath the table, ready to run if he had to. But when Richard returned, his expression wasn't cold. It wasn't even skeptical. It was calm, almost kind. "Help is on the way," Richard said simply. Malik blinked. "Help?" His brows furrowed, suspicion creeping in. Richard nodded. "I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight. Somewhere safe." Then he hesitated. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, sincere. "And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that." Malik's eyes widened. His pulse spiked. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly, his voice defensive. "I didn't do this for money or anything." Richard smiled faintly. "I know." His voice carried a certainty that made Malik pause. "That's exactly why I want to help you." He held the boy's gaze, his expression unreadable but not unfeeling. "You did something most people wouldn't have." Then, a small knowing nod. "And trust me, Malik, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place." For the first time in a long time, Malik felt something unfamiliar, something warm, something he couldn't quite name. He glanced down, suddenly unsure of what to say. The cafe patrons had begun to disperse, their hushed murmurs fading into the background. But the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Richard reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip before speaking again. His voice was thoughtful, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "Sometimes, life gives us the chance to change someone else's story." He set the glass down, his gaze settling on Malik. "You changed mine today." Then a pause, a small, quiet smile. "And maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." The words hung in the air. Malik glanced up, his dark eyes shimmering with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a kid surviving in the shadows. He was seen. He was valued. And maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The two sat in silence, letting the moment settle as the sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the cafe. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed what had happened that day. Courage doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness doesn't always come from the wealthy. Sometimes it's the people we overlook who hold the greatest strength of all. In the end, Malik's bravery didn't just save a life. It reminded everyone in that cafe of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and be part of a journey filled with tales of courage, truth, and redemption. And if you know someone who might need a reminder that even the smallest act of bravery can ripple into something life-changing, share this video. Because sometimes one decision, one voice, one fearless moment can change everything.